Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Tools for Civic Action in Our Democracy Now session. My name is Martha Heeter, and I am the Executive Director for PlanRVA, which is a regional support organization for the localities of the Richmond region in preparing for and planning the future that we envision for our community. I am so honored to be a part of this RVA Engage series hosted by the University of Richmond's Bonner Center for Civic Engagement, the VCU Center for Community Engagement and Impact, and the Community Foundation for Greater Richmond. This series was created so we might reflect about our democracy now and the deep divisions in our country and region and build tools for us to move forward together. And so tonight, I'd like to take a moment to recognize our history, and it's important in the context of this series. Here in the Richmond region, we stand on land that was, at the time of the British arrival, the territory of the Powhatan people. While we are grateful for the virtual platform that enables so many of us to connect, we recognize our benefit from this equipment and connectivity is not equally available to everyone. My personal hope is that we use the lessons from this series to bridge the gaps in our neighborhoods, our communities, and our lives so that we might enjoy the future that lies ahead. Now, before I introduce our speakers, some housekeeping items for you. We do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature on your Zoom toolbar. Also, closed captioning has been enabled for this event, but please be aware that the transcription may contain errors. You can toggle this feature on or off by clicking the Live Captions button and selecting Show or Hide subtitles. This event is based on values of mutual respect among our presenters and audience. We reserve the right to remove any audience member whose behavior counters this expectation. We are recording this event, which will be posted on the RVA Engage website for later viewing. That link will be shared with you in a follow-up email, and we encourage you to participate in our survey so we can learn and improve from your input. I am so pleased tonight to introduce our speakers and cannot wait to dive into tonight's program. Dr. Chris Ball is an associate professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at the College of William and Mary. He is originally from Australia, where he completed his undergraduate degrees in mathematics and psychology and his doctoral degree in psychology. Dr. Ball is a cognitive psychologist with research interests in memory, reasoning, and decision-making. He has published and presented intensively on these research topics. In his spare time, he coaches rugby and enjoys traveling, kayaking, and fishing. Stephanie Naya Rodgers is the Public Affairs Librarian and Government Documents Librarian at the Commonwealth of Virginia Commonwealth University. She also hosts a podcast titled Civil Discourse. Patty Conway is Community Relations Coordinator at Henrico County Public Library. Ms. Conway manages community engagement, public relations, social media, website design, and large-scale events coordination at Henrico Public Libraries. She fell in love with the library work as a clerk for the Avery Fisher Center for Music and Media at Bob's Library while completing her BA in anthropology at New York University. She received a master's in library and information sciences from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2015. From 2009 to 2017, she toured and recorded as a member of various rock and roll groups in New York, DC, and Richmond, and co-owns the Fuzzy Cactus Bar and music venue in Richmond with her husband. She loves playing drums, cooking, and pit bulls. Finally, Amy Wentz is a Richmond native and Southside resident for over 35 years. She is a devoted mother, veteran, entrepreneur, innovator, and public advocate. A proud graduate of Richmond Public Schools, Amy has firm ideas on how to improve communication throughout the 8th District in order to keep residents informed of important issues. As an advocate of active leadership, Amy truly believes that engaged and informed residents lead to better communities. Recently named a 2020 Richmond History Maker by the Valentine Museum for her dedicated and sustainable service to the city of Richmond, Amy is no stranger to working hard to uplift her hometown. I'm just so excited to hear from each of you tonight, and I will turn the mic over to Chris. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful series and to be included in such an important discussion. It has forced me to think more deeply about something that I've been preaching to my students for the past few years, and that is how do scientists and scholars do a better job of presenting their knowledge to a wider public audience. For instance, my students now are replacing papers with internet blogs with the hope that this information will now reach a wider audience than just me. But as you will soon realize, I'm not very experienced at doing this myself, such as providing this talk. I will begin my talk by introducing the general approach that researchers like me follow, and that is often referred to as the heuristics and biases approach to decision-making and judgment. Then I'll provide you with a brief description of 3 such biases that I believe are relevant to this panel's discussion. We are currently living in the information age. Our access to information is increasing at an exponential rate with the development and access of smaller and more powerful computers in the 1980s, the development of the internet, the World Wide Web in the 1990s. These technological developments have continued to accelerate in the past few years with the creation of smartphones and wireless cellular technology. Of course, some people are also referring to our most recent time period as the misinformation age, as our access to incorrect information is also rapidly expanding at this time. Obviously, to make an informed judgmental decision, you need access to the most reliable and valid information on the topic. The good news is that the other members of this panel are experts at directing people on the correct pathways to accessing that good information. The bad news is that I will suggest you are still likely to make faulty judgments and decisions even with access to this good information. I'm not a political psychologist or a psychologist who specializes in mass media and communications. They would have lots of excellent advice on this general topic and describe the social and political implications of the different sources of information currently accessible in our society. I am, however, a cognitive psychologist, and we are interested in how the mind processes this information and how the inherent constraints of the human brain may not allow for optimal processing of this information. The access and sharing of information has rapidly expanded and changed over the past 50 years, but the human brain has changed very little at all during the same time period. But in my defense, I will also try to temper this rather pessimistic view of how we use information by providing you with some example of how researchers in my field are also attempting to correct or de-bias these faulty judgments. So let me quickly introduce you to the heuristics and biases approach. Herb Simon was a Nobel Prize winning psychologist from Carnegie Mellon University and one of the first cognitive scientists in the 1950s to examine how people make decisions and make judgments. He believed our judgments were rational, but they were bounded by our cognitive constraints. Another Nobel Prize winning psychologist, Daniel Cunningham from Princeton University, and his colleague, Amos Tversky, began to outline in the 1970s how we make decisions and judgments using cognitive heuristics or mental shortcuts, but that these mental shortcuts can often lead to faulty, biased decisions and judgments. They started to identify and name these biases and speculate about the underlying cognitive processes that trigger these biases, and this research approach has continued to flourish until this present day. What makes these biases difficult to combat is that the decision maker is often unaware of these biases when making their judgments. The mental shortcuts that generate these biases are often being performed without any conscious awareness of doing so. And this is one of the main reasons these biases are so difficult to correct. I'd like to now discuss 3 of these biases that I think would be of particular interest to an audience concerned about civic action. One cognitive bias has possibly received more attention than any other bias during this difficult, highly partisan political time in America is the confirmation bias. For decades, we've known that people will look for information and remember that information better if it confirms with their current beliefs or views. This confirmation bias can lead to faulty judgments that could often be quickly corrected if the individual making these judgments would just examine the evidence that disconfirms their current position or answer. Some scholars have recently suggested that the confirmation bias can be blamed for a variety of our world's problems, such as the spread of misinformation, the failure of voters to engage in a variety of different opinions, and even possibly a significant contributor to the rise of ideological extremism. Well, how do we combat this bias? Many cognitive psychologists like Cunningham and Tversky distinguish 2 styles of thinking. The first is a reflective, analytical, critical thinking style. And the second is an intuitive, automatic, heuristic style of thinking. One way to combat any bias, including the confirmation bias, is to encourage critical, analytical thinking when searching for and analyzing the relevant information. Unfortunately, our natural tendency is to follow the alternative and intuitive heuristic style of thinking. One way to encourage critical thinking when faced with the confirmation bias is just simply to ask the individual to consider the opposite. For example, to ask them, what are some reasons that their initial judgment may be wrong? Clearly, you can also see why the goal of developing critical thinking skills in our younger people is certainly one of the most important developments of the contemporary education movement. The next bias I'd like to introduce is sometimes referred to as the base rate neglect bias. Currently in this country, during this terrible COVID-19 pandemic, we are performing around 2 million tests daily for the presence of the COVID-19 virus. But if you get a positive result from this test, how would you interpret this test result? This seems like a rather stupid question. A positive test result means that I have the virus. But that is actually unlikely to be true for screening tests like the COVID-19 test, with a low prevalence rate for having the disease and given the test diagnostic accuracy, even if it is a very accurate test, which this one is. Because like most screening tests, there's also a chance that a positive result could be false and that the test taker does not actually have the virus. In fact, for most screening tests, the number of false positives can outnumber the true positives if the prevalence or the base rate of the disease is very low. So the probability of having the disease, if you did get a positive test result, is much lower than most people judge, even for a highly accurate test, like the PCR molecular test for the presence of COVID-19. A second test is always recommended when a positive screening test result is obtained. But these test results can take days to confirm the results of the first test, assuming the test taker actually follows up with a second test. The emotional and behavioral effects that can result from a false positive test result, or for that matter, a false negative test result, can be substantial but preventable if the test taker, and often the test giver, would use this information correctly. I have spent many years examining the problems associated with interpreting screening test results. And of course, this examination has become even more salient during the past 12 months. What happens if we provide people with the correct information about the prevalence rate of the disease and the accuracy information for the diagnostic test? Well, I've tested hundreds, maybe thousands of people, mainly college students, over the last few years, and less than 10% of them will provide the correct answer. The answers will range from 0 likelihood to 100% likelihood of having disease if provided with a positive test result. These sort of faulty judgments are also being found to be made by health professionals and even individuals who are forewarned about making such faulty judgments. Obviously, providing the test taker and the test giver with the correct information about the prevalence of disease and the test diagnostic accuracy is not enough to guarantee a correct interpretation of the test result. Researchers like myself are working on ways of presenting this screening test information so that the test taker has a better chance of correctly interpreting the test result. One recent method that has had some limited success is to simply change the format of how you provide the information, provide it in terms of frequencies rather than the traditional probability or percentage format. The final bias I would like to describe is called the framing effect bias. And I'd like to finish with this one study that uses this cognitive bias to actually provide information in a way that had a positive benefit for the targets of the information. These researchers took advantage of the framing effect and that people are generally loss averse. Well, what does that mean? A decision problem can be framed as a loss, and this frame would be perceived as a much stronger negative effect than if the same problem is posed in a gain frame with a positive effect. Let me help explain this bias by using this one particular study. So these researchers provided female workers at a factory with information about breast cancer and the benefits of mammogram testing. Half of the women received the information in a gain frame. The other half of the women received the same information in a loss frame. For example, this statement was included for both groups. Although all women are at risk for breast cancer, there is something you can do to increase your chances of surviving it. That's the positive frame, the wording of a positive frame. Give the same information, but use a loss frame. Although all women are at risk for breast cancer, there is something you can do to decrease your risk of dying from it. Increase your chance of surviving it, positive frame. Decrease your risk of dying it, a loss frame. Would this wording change, a simple wording change to the frame used, change these women's attitudes to taking a mammogram test? Would the loss frame produce a stronger effect than the gain frame, even when the basic message stayed the same? And it did. The researchers found that substantially more women obtained a mammogram test in the next 12 months when they had received the loss information than women who had received the gain information. A simple rewording of the information presented to these women had a significant effect on health promotion. In conclusion, although we may not always make the optimal decision, even when the best information is available, for the most part, I believe we generally make good rational choices, as long as all decision makers have equal access to that information. The constraints of the human brain to cognitively process all of the necessary information to make an informed decision certainly provides us all with many challenges for making better decisions, but psychologists are working hard to help overcome those challenges. Thank you. I'd like to pass on to one of our librarians who'll tell you about all the good ways of getting good information, Nia Rodgers.
Thank you, Dr. Ball. I appreciate that. Okay, so you make terrible decisions, give up, go home, we're done. Right? That's it. This is a short presentation. Thanks for showing up. No, not really. Right? So there are all these confirmation problems, or a confirmation bias, which is the most common, although the other two I've learned a lot about this evening, and I have many, many thoughts rolling around in my head right now. But I think that one of the ways that we can combat our instinctive sort of that we don't consciously aware, we're not consciously aware we're making a decision, we just make a decision, is to constantly interrogate ourselves about why. Now, a favorite thing that librarians do, and you'll have to forgive us, Patty and I probably both do this to our friends and family and loved ones, so you're no different to us, which is we say cite a source. Right? Whenever someone says to me, 84% of people hate kale, I say, cite a source. It's not that I don't believe you. I'm not a huge fan, but it doesn't mean that it's true just because you said it was true and I like you. You're a friend of mine, right? I need you to give me a better reason to believe than because I like you. We tend to do that, right? We tend to listen to people we like. We tend to dismiss people we don't like. We also tend to dismiss people based in what we perceive to be ill will. And I think that that is a tool we need to put back in the toolbox and use a lot less. One of the things that that Martha described at the beginning of this presentation was that we have mutual respect as part of the standard of this series, right? We respect each other's ideas and we bring to the table those ideas and we listen. And so it's really important that you assume not ill will on the other side, because you will never get anywhere in any kind of discussion if you assume that the other person is trying to hurt you or trying to give you bad information. They're giving you information from a set of experiences. And while that may not be your life experience, that doesn't negate that it's their life experience. I have been a woman my whole life. I've never been a man. I don't know what it is to live in a world, in this world, in a man's form. I don't know what they go through. I don't know how that works for them. So in order to understand the male position, I need to listen when they explain it to me. That doesn't mean I have to agree. It means I have to be respectful and I have to listen. And then I have to interrogate. And by interrogate here, I don't mean the sort of bright light with the one chair and the, you know, you're really, really sad at the end of it. I don't mean that. I mean interrogate in the sense of, tell me more about that. Tell me why you're coming from that position, because I want to understand so that we can connect at some level. I think almost everyone wants to do the right thing. It's just that people have a different view of what the right thing is. And so one of the tools of democracy is your ears. And the other tool is your brain, right? Slow down, listen, and think it through. And Dr. Ball said something very important, which is assume the opposite. Consider the opposite. What if I did think X thing? Why would I think that thing? And maybe reason through that with someone, which will help that with communication. Communication is key to democracy. Me standing and shouting at you and you standing and shouting at me is not communication, right? That's just an exchange of spit. That's not how we can make the world a better place. The way we make the world a better place is by listening and talking to each other and assuming that people want to do the right thing. The other thing that we sort of miss sometimes, I think, is that we get so caught up in the national level of democracy that we forget that democracy happens in our neighborhood first. Like democracy is local. almost every decision that gets made that truly affects your life is made by the city council, is made by the mayor, is made by the governor, right? That's us. That's local. And all of that is accessible to you. You can go to city council meetings. You can go, and how will you know when they're happening? Look in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, or the Virginia Mercury, or Ross Catro has a RVA Today, right, that he puts out a newsletter every day that talks about these meetings and when these meetings are happening. Find somebody who can tell you when something's going on, and then go and listen and ask questions. There's no dumb question. I know that gets a bad rap, that phrase, because, when people say it, sometimes they're saying it insincerely, but they shouldn't, because there is no dumb question. There is no question that you shouldn't ask if you don't know the answer to it. And you should feel comfortable in saying to your elected officials, why? Why do we have to do it that way? Why can't we do it this way? Or what are our other options? Or how do we think about these things differently? I think that that's a huge part of engagement that we forget, is that we can go and we can listen to the horse's mouth. And I promise you, what you read in the paper is a summary of a very long meeting that happened where there was a lot of nuance that you missed because you weren't there. And so that's not always important, but for some issues, it's really important. And those issues are different for different people. Bike lanes are hugely important to one of my colleagues at work. I don't ride a bike. And so while I care about bikes, about cycle safety, in terms of being a motorist, and I want to make sure that I'm not going to injure cyclists, where the lanes go, I hate to say, I'm not really too worried about. It's not very nice for me to say, but it's true. I mean, I want them to go to nice places so people can go to parks and do interesting things. But I also, that's not that's not one of the dogs in my kennel, as my grandfather would say. But what I do care about, I care deeply about year-round school. I don't have children in the year-round school system or in the school system, but I care deeply about year-round school because I'm a librarian. And the way that we help children and the way that we can have library services for them is we really need to know when they're going to be in school, when they're not going to be in school, so that we can plan those events. So that's something that's really important to me. We go to meetings, different meetings with different agendas. So you should probably think about engaging in that way if you can, because it's so much easier to avoid confirmation bias at the local level. And that's because the silo is smaller, right? There's just a lot less people pushing their agenda on you and pushing you to feel a certain way. And so you have a lot more autonomy than you do in sort of the larger national discussion, which becomes very agendized in the sense of pushing a viewpoint. And the other thing I want to remind people, and then I will hand off to Patty, is that I don't have to prove why I believe something to anyone else, but I should prove it to myself. I should know why. And if I don't know why, I should understand that it's instinct and not based in any reality, and therefore changeable, right? I can change. It's not based in fact, so I can change how I feel about something. And I think that is so hard for us as humans, because we have a tendency to get into a rut and stay in that rut. And I think Dr. Ball would back me up on that it's really hard for us to break that edge of something that we believe, especially if we believe it irrationally, right? If we don't have anything where we can point to something that we can talk about why we believe it. And so always interrogate yourself and keep asking yourself those questions and asking other people those questions. And you know who can help you with that? Librarians can help you with that. And especially Patty, who's going to talk about that now.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much, RVA Engage, for the opportunity to be here this evening. It's such an honor to be here alongside these wonderful panelists. So my name is Patty Conway, and you heard my bio before. I'm a public librarian, and that means I'm one of hundreds of people in our metro area alone who are at your service to help connect you to the information you need. And I think now it's such a critical time, not just to be connected to information, that's the easy part with the internet, but getting connected to high quality, reliable information, that's the real challenge, because misinformation is a real problem today. And it's something that many of us might think of as someone else's problem, something for people who believe in QAnon or watch YouTube videos instead of researching with peer-reviewed journals and other reliable sources. But misinformation affects all of us, and it can be perpetuated by all of us. Information literacy is complex, and it is growing ever more so all the time as technology continues to change how we discover information. So as an example of this, I wanted to share something that many librarians simply refer to as the chart. I recently read an essay by the head of research at William and Mary and a library administrator at the Missouri Legislative Library about this chart from Ad Fontes Media. You may have seen it. I hadn't given much thought to the chart before. I hadn't thought about it critically when I encountered it, but I should have. And the fact that I hadn't really thought about it and just casually scrolled by says to me that no one is immune to misinformation online. So this chart ranks media sources as more reliable or less reliable on the y-axis, and from left bias to right bias on the x-axis. The result is a pyramid of media sources with outlets like AP and Reuters right at the top. You have likely seen this chart on social media or some version of it. It's changed a lot over time. Many people that I consider and know to be generally well-informed and well-educated have shared this chart. So I'm not talking about the chart today to shame anybody, but instead I'm talking about it to just encourage all of us to think deeply and critically and use tools available to us when we're evaluating information. Misinformation today is so subtle and so insidious that if you shared the chart, you probably had the best of intentions. This was circulating a lot around the time of the last election when people were talking a lot about like, what's fake news? What's reliable news? But there are shades of misinformation, right? The chart is not necessarily inciting violence, but it is reinforcing some other dangerous societal trends and issues like racism, political polarization, the death of the independent local press, and an overly simplified view of media literacy. The creator of the chart is a lawyer, not a librarian, not a media analyst. In the past, she worked in pharmaceutical sales. She also worked for a non-accredited vocational school of real estate investing that shuttered after accusations of being a multi-level marketing scam surfaced against the school. Then she created the chart, and now she has a nonprofit based around the chart called Ad Fontes Media. She used to be the sole creator and maintainer of the chart. Now she is advised by a bipartisan board of analysts and media industry members. Now, the chart has had issues from its inception, including issues of inclusion. You'll notice on the chart that we saw before, there was one Black media outlet, The Root, featured on it. That's a recent addition. The meme version of the chart that I saw around the time of the election was all white dominated, major multinational media organizations. There are no local papers on the chart. If your media is to the left or the right of the center that the chart determines, then it is labeled as biased. So the root is labeled as belonging to the skews left section, and at times it has belonged to the hyperpartisan left section, which undercuts its credibility. The center is assumed to have no bias. So centrism and its purported lack of bias as reflected on the chart just so happens to align with historically white and male-dominated national and multinational news corporations, which also reflect and reinforce the power structures in our society. The center is assumed to be a fixed place, but who fixes it? Does Ad Fontes Media fix what the center is? I think some of us who follow American politics know that the center is a political position. It has a bias. Centrism has an agenda, and that position evolves over time. It's not fixed. And then according to the chart, everyone outside of that very top of the pyramid structure who hold views to either the right or left, probably the vast majority of us, does that mean then that we all have biased or unreliable viewpoints? So I think the chart can be really polarizing in that way. Many more issues with the chart are outlined in this great essay. I'm going to just throw a link to it in the chat. Hope that works. Yep. The essay also provides some great tools with which you can evaluate media from kind of more of an academic perspective. But really, I wanted to talk to you all today about the chart because I wanted to illustrate that no one is immune to misinformation, and that media literacy and information literacy are too complex to be reduced to a meme or a chart, and that when that kind of simplification is attempted, we risk excluding voices belonging to different identities, to local and regional viewpoints. We also risk promoting political polarization. So it's probably a good rule of thumb that if you see something really complex being reduced to a two-dimensional visual, that's an oversimplification. And if it's shared, it can function as misinformation. But what do we do in a world where it's so hard to find information of a high quality, or to know if something is reliable information when so much information out there looks and feels reliable and even purports to be reliable, but it isn't upon closer investigation? And if you ever encounter information you're not sure about, or if you're looking for more information to fact check or to understand the bias of a piece of media you encounter, what do you do? When we were asked to join this panel, one question posed to me was, if there was one discovery tool you wish people knew to use, what would that be? The answer in my mind to that question, and then to the two that I posed just before it, is your public librarians. You may not know this, but we would be thrilled to help you explore the quality and reliability of a piece of journalism or other media that you found in print or online. It is absolutely part of our job to do this with and for you. We take very seriously the quality and reliability of information and our role in civic life, and we are available to you free of charge wherever you might live. There are librarians in every community, supported by your tax dollars, who are passionate about service, community, and about information literacy. I think informed communities are strong communities. Misinformed communities, as we have seen, can be divided and divisive. Misinformation can perpetuate and amplify our worst biases and prejudices. So next time you see a meme like the chart, or you encounter a piece of information and you get that feeling like, this kind of feels right, but it seems simple or something seems off, give your library a call or send us a message. We would love to hear from you, and we would love to help you. Thank you so much. And Amy Wentz will be speaking with us next.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for including me in this panel. I just really enjoyed hearing the information so far from the other panelists. Yes, I am Amy Wentz. I am I won't say lifetime because I've spent a couple of years in the military and some time supporting military efforts in other countries. But for the most of my life, I've been a Richmond resident. I've been raised on the South Side. When I came back from the military, I used my VA loan to reside right here in the 8th District on the South Side. And so I love it here. I do my best to get information out to folks as best I can. So I wanted to highlight 3 ways that I have seen how information is valued and some practical tips on how we can find and use data as evidence and evidence as it pertains to civic and local engagement efforts. And some of the panelists had already kind of touched on some of these things, but I'm just going to elaborate a little bit. So the first is that neighbors that are engaged and understand how to navigate the process to get things done in and around their communities are more likely to step up and get involved. And one way that we can provide equity and resources and programs is to make the best effort in ensuring folks are in the know. We have all heard the term, the squeaky wheel gets the oil when it comes to local services, and neighborhoods and civic areas that know how to make their voices heard are usually the ones that get the improvements. Sometimes this comes down to discovery and who knows what. So I'll give an example. There may be a developer that wants to rezone an area or get a special use permit for a specific facility or building. And the city puts up signs for public comment. And so we've all seen those signs before. They're the blue signs. They might have a phone number on there to call this number. And let's say neighbors see the notices and they make that trip to city council to speak for or against this development. I have this is a true story, actually. They'll sit through the entire meeting not realizing when they were supposed to get up to speak because they didn't understand that the particular item was on the consent agenda. Some people don't know have a clue what a consent agenda is, and they don't understand that sometimes council, summarizes some of the things they don't feel are going to have any conflict onto a consent agenda, and they'll do like a one sweep vote on it. And they'll be sitting there till the end of the meeting and like, well, when are we supposed to speak? And it's like, oh, we actually voted on that at the beginning of the meeting during the consent agenda. So, even when people attempt to make their voice heard, if they don't understand the terms and the process, it could affect their ability to advocate for themselves and others. So this is one of the things that I'm working on with my city civics class. That I have been giving to civic associations and neighborhood advocacy groups on just learning what these terms mean and how to advocate for yourself. So that's number one. The second one, I apologize. I have a 6-year-old who's coming in and, excuse me, I'm on a panel. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. The second, it's important to use peer-to-peer or a collaborative effort in discovery and sharing information. I might be the mama who's at home cooking dinner for 3 little ones after school, or I may be the retiree that doesn't like to travel at night, but we still want to get information. So working within civic or neighborhood groups to assign neighbors to certain areas of interest is a great practice. Some call it asset planning, if you've heard of asset planning before, just making sure neighbors are matched with interests that are important to them, so people aren't tiring out, getting worn out, or getting overwhelmed. I may like attending school board meetings and keeping track of things related to education. But my neighbor may be more connected to environmental issues in this city. And so then when we come together, we can all update each other on the things that we have learned from the meetings or the efforts that we have been a part of. So that's the second one. The third one is just making sure that we are meeting folks where they are and ensuring information is as easy to understand as possible. In a city that is so diverse and folks have different educational backgrounds, languages, and abilities, it's important that information is accessible. I'll give you an example that we're working on right now with a nonprofit that I'm a co-founder of, Southside Relief. We're working on greening efforts in the city and trying to ensure that former redlined areas are receiving equity when it comes to environmental efforts. And one thing, we had a meeting with the city and they wanted to talk about sustainability and how we could educate the community or get the community's input on sustainability. And I remember sitting in this meeting and saying to myself, first of all, I probably didn't even know what these terms meant up until a few years ago myself. And so I know if it's hard for me to understand certain things that it's going to be hard for us to engage the community on these specific efforts. And so just making sure that we are making things plain, so that as we share information, that people understand how it affects them. And so I'll give another example. We're really trying to educate the community. We have a lot of flooding here in Southside, and some of it is in you know, issues with our infrastructure and just kind of neglect over the years. But some of it is some things that we can, as a community, can work together to fix. For example, we might, you know, our bus stops over here, so it takes a while to get from one bus stop to to another. We have some transportation, you know, we need some improvements over here, but there might not be a trash can, right, that is accessible. So I'm at the store, I'm getting my little snack. I know I can't bring it on the bus. And what do? I kind of toss it onto the street, which eventually during the storm, it goes down the drain, and then trash kind of builds up and the stormwater drain is getting clogged up. And then that's helping to cause the flooding in our neighborhoods that bring the mosquitoes. So just showing the whole, like, why throwing our trash out is bad is a little bit how it affects us as a community, how it affects me in my house, how it affects me in the summer times with the mosquitoes that I gotta keep hitting off of my hands and stuff like that. So just trying to make things plain for folks so they can understand how it affects them, their livelihood, and their families. And so that's the third thing, just making sure that we're meeting folks where they are and ensuring information is easy to understand. I'll close by just saying that uneducated residents are often manipulated and taken advantage of, and it's not a good thing. And so, you know, I've seen this before, you know, well, we're dealing with it now on a series of, you know, homes in Southside that someone didn't get a special use permit, but turned them into duplexes without going through the proper process, and just understanding that that's probably because they know that, you know, some of the members of that community are probably not going to notice or know to even advocate. And so I really want to be the information girl. I try not to be on a support side of a thing or opposed to a thing, rather just sharing the information so that people in my area know how to make the decision for themselves and have all the information out there. And sometimes, I might get criticized for that because folks either want me to be for a thing or against a thing. I try to stay neutral so that I can be the person that's trying to help disseminate the information so that people can make a decision for themselves. And I'll say that, sorry, y'all, my 6-year-old. No, baby, you just give me a few minutes, okay? Yeah, so what was I saying? Oh yeah, so if people aren't being educated and understanding what's happening, what's the point, right? So we might not like something to happen and we're all, no, we're not gonna do this. No, we're getting people to say no. But if they really didn't understand or, understand the information or understand how it affected them, where are we, So anyone that would like to help me finalize this city civics course that I've been working on for so long, or have any ideas, I'll put my information in the chat, and I'd love to get your input and to get your help. And I'll send it back to Martha.
Wow, well, thank you all so much. I mean, what a great opener. I'm having a hard time, to be honest with you, deciding what question I want to ask first. But I'm just really curious to know, first and foremost, what a great connection each of you made to last week's session and this idea of this kind of self-interrogation. I really appreciated hearing that kind of woven through, I think, almost all of your comments. But I'm curious maybe to hear a little bit about your thoughts in what you think the implications of this last year of isolation for so many people, and what that has done to our ability to check those biases and to, consider the alternative or the opposing viewpoint, and really kind of to think about, Nael, I love just what you said about, like, not assuming that everyone is coming at us with ill will. And so I'm just curious, from each of your perspectives, what you think that isolation and what's the path forward?
Well, I'll go first. I think that at least for me, and I think probably for a lot of people, because I live alone, there's just been me rolling around in my own head for quite a while. And so I have had to push myself to reach out to people with different viewpoints. What happens often is that something will come up in a local or a regional issue, and I reach out to people that I know are on a different part of the political spectrum than I am, and I say, what am I missing? Here's what I think. What am I missing? And they say, oh, okay, well, here's a hole that I see. Here's a hole that I see. And I say, okay, well, then what about this? And they say, oh, well, that's interesting. And we're able to have a discussion. I'm looking forward to a time when we can do that more in person, because it's so hard when you can't read people's body language to assume that they're being honest and sincere. Email is a terrible way to communicate. And you can't read sarcasm. You also can't read lightheartedness. You can't read a joke in email. It's very difficult. So I'm hoping to see some of that storm lift a little, maybe at the end of our time alone, which I am hoping will be, knocking on wood, sometime in the fall. It looks like, at least for Virginia Commonwealth, it looks like we're going to be back mostly in person in the fall. Limited, but somewhat in person at least. So I think I think there's hope, but we are very polarized. As a society, we're very polarized, and we're very prickly. We bring our feelings into it immediately, and that's not always the best place for us to. One of the things they teach you in librarian school is how to not react immediately emotionally to the question you're asked. Right? It's called the reference interview, which is sort of tell me more about that and let's figure out what you need. And I think more people would benefit if they did that.
There was a GIF. I don't know if people know what a GIF is, but graphical something that was circulating on Twitter this week. But it was showing two packs of dogs on the side of a fence, right? And they were just barking at each other. And the fence is opening up. Like, I guess it's one of those retractable gates that open up, and the dogs just kind of walk away. And, like they're acting like they're fighting, but as soon as they're able to kind of talk to each other, they kind of walk away. And someone said, this is Twitter, because we're on, people are on Twitter, they're thumbing, they're talking to each other. But then when you talk to them in person, it's a whole different thing. And I think that one of the things, there's an organization here in the city called RVA. They've been doing this thing called Stay Chats, and they're bringing in the elected officials so that people from the community can kind of have chats about them, just learn about their personal, some of their personal history, why they became an elected official, and some of the things that they've been able to, outside of some of the debates that we have as a city, just getting to know them on a personal level. And I really feel like, just like Ms. Rodgers says, that when you talk to folks in person and you really see their intentions, and they might not make decisions that we, often agree with, or we may disagree. But when you talk to folks face to face, it makes communication a little bit, to me, gentler, maybe a little bit kinder. And we're not so quick to say some of the things that we wouldn't say to people in person. So I'm looking forward to getting back to getting to know folks, and getting off some of the social media platforms where it's easier to kind of say what we feel sometimes.
Thank you for that. Amy, I love that recommendation that you made about sort of assigning different responsibilities among neighbors, and really kind of leaning into what interests are. Any tips for folks out there that also like that idea but maybe don't know their neighbors that well?
Yeah, so one thing, I grew up as a Presbyterian, and one of the things the Presbyterians always had is committees. We had committees for everything. There was always committees at my church. And so we've had some issues in certain neighborhoods over here where we haven't been able to get an actual civic association started, so that folks can actually do some of this work. But it starts with just finding a common goal, right? There's this one area, I think it's called British Camp Farms. They don't have a civic association, but one of the things that they noticed, that there was a lot of speeding that was happening on this particular street. And so just neighbors coming together around a common goal. And then if you're able to see some improvements on that goal, right, you've made enough noise that it helps you go to the next goal and to the next goal. So just trying to come together on a particular item or an issue that you might see in your community, or a hope or desire, and then building from there, I think is a great practice.
Thank you. Thank you. Patty, this question came in from one of the attendees, and I think it might be a little bit in reference to that chart that you showed us. But asking about NPR and what your thoughts are, really any of the panelists' thoughts are, is it, useful, reliable, truthful? Obviously there's commentary as well as news coverage on that. So just curious what your thoughts might be about.
Honestly, I would evaluate pieces of media on a piece by piece basis. I don't think I would analyze the entire source. Media, I think, there's a sentence maybe in that essay that I shared, and it's a really nice encapsulation of this thought, but media companies are collections of people who work for them. So every writer is going to have some kind of different approach. So if you're concerned, if you find something from NPR and you're like, I'm not sure about this, look up the author, see what else they've written, see what editorials they've written, see if you agree with them. I don't think I wouldn't, there are some sure media sources that I would just like completely rule out, that I wouldn't even consider news. But NPR is one that I certainly would. And I think you can absolutely listen to NPR. I would just always listen to everything with a grain of salt. And then if, like I was saying, you hear something and you're like, that sounds awfully simplified, or like, I've got a weird gut feeling about that, do a little digging, or call me at the library and ask me. And it's my job to do a little bit of digging for you. So.
And can I say also, if you hear something that you absolutely love and you're like, yes, that thing right there, also stop and ask yourself why, right? Because it's super easy to fall into the, well, they agree with me because I'm brilliant. Of course they agree with me. Why wouldn't they? But you need to ask yourself, okay, well, why are we all in this well shouting together? What's going on with that? It's not always things you disagree with, although totally Patty's right on that, right? If you disagree or it sounds weird, you should check it out. But also if it sounds too good to be true, I mean, that old aphorism, it's there for a reason. So think about that as well. That's why I make it my media practice to consume a wide variety of media. I consume people I like. I consume people I don't necessarily like. I consume up and down the dial, as it were, trying to find all the different things that aggravate me.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this sort of opportunity both you and Patty have recommended. And I mean, Chris, it goes back to that very first bias that you talked about, confirmation bias. And it strikes me that particularly with social media, but with, the algorithms, and I definitely know, I mean, if I utter a word about a product in my house, all of a sudden it's showing up in my feed and ads and everything. And so, I mean, Chris, I'm intrigued by this opportunity that has been extended to us to seek out, experts in information to really be able to check those confirmation biases.
Actually, not everybody thinks the internet is a bad thing, and that there is access to as much good information as misinformation, and you can check that misinformation. I think the critical thing that comes from psychology research is that you need to inoculate people. You need to give them the information before, so that if you want to stop people who are believing in conspiracy theories, you provide the evidence before they get to hear the conspiracy theory, because it's after they hear the conspiracy theory to change their point of view. And so I think, that just, again, is not only getting different sources of information, but getting it early before you're following the news story rather than anticipating where it's going.
Interesting.
Which is why we should always demand as much transparency from government as possible. It's much harder to have conspiracy theories around things when people have been absolutely clear about what they were trying to do and why they were trying to do it. So the more that we demand that as citizens, the less misinformation we will have to deal with, because we will be able to say, well, we can look at the process. It is a transparent thing, and that's what we should be demanding pretty much every day from government. Sorry, soapbox.
No, thank you. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I've got two more questions that have come through on the chat, so I'll go to that, but then I've got a couple on my own. So folks that are out there attending, please send your Q&A in so we don't just hear what I'm thinking about. I'm interested to know, a couple of you have kind of references, but curious, maybe some examples of your favorite blogs or publications or other source material that obviously you seek out to then verify, but curious, you know, who and what do you follow?
I'll say something. I read a lot of news and media, all kinds. And, you know, like I subscribe to like Jacobin, but I read the Wall Street Journal. I have one of my close friends put up like a tweet the other day that said, friends don't let friends read the New York Times. And I was like, okay, but I subscribe to the New York Times and I read it every day, you know, but I read all of it. I mean, I read USA Today. I read, and this is mostly on my phone. Then, you know, all kinds of like magazines. I like cooking magazines, but I try to read Washington Post. I try to read NPR, Wall Street Journal, then some like articles occasionally in more conservative leaning magazines, and then some in more leftist leaning magazines. But it's a variety because I think it's interesting, and I look critically at everything that I read, which is also kind of like a fun, mentally challenging activity for me.
I read a lot of foreign news sources. I like to see the way other countries see us and see what's going on. I can't do that for local news, but I also read several things for local news. I read Richmond Mag and Style Weekly and Ross's newsletter and the Richmond Times-Dispatch and the Virginia Mercury, right? Like those are all in my news feed, like, so they come through on a pretty regular basis. But I love to look at the way the French press sees us, or Al Jazeera sees us, or BBC sees us, because it's different, and it kind of stops you a little bit, and you go, oh, other countries think we're crazy, or whatever, and it's kind of an interesting balance of where we are in the world, because I think sometimes we think of ourselves as sort of isolated, but we're not. Obviously, with globalism, we're not. But I agree with Patty that it's a mixture too. I'm interested in what Chris reads.
You know, you guys putting me to shame. I don't read a lot, you know, outside. Following up your point about international reading, though, I'm Australian, so I read Australian and American sources. And it is interesting to see how I think Australians can be a little bit more objective or distant from the American media presentation. So you do get a different viewpoint and maybe a little bit of a clearer picture than the kind of, you know, images you get from the American media. But I certainly can't compete with you guys in terms of the source of information. I'm sorry, I just don't.
No, I may have to add an Australian paper.
I'll just add that locally, I tend to go to VPM, which is like the Virginia version of the subsidiary, I guess, of NPR. And of course, I read the Richmond Free Press. You know, that was our Black founded paper here in the city, and have continued on. They tend to sometimes be a little opinionated in some of their writing, but sometimes they get into some meat and potatoes to some of the issues that we have here.
Just as a follow-up, what would be your advice for some folks that might be like myself, who get into a bit of a cycle of media overload and fatigue? I feel like I'm in that cycle that I know a lot of friends and colleagues are in, where we just literally have to disconnect and take a few days or weeks off. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily healthy either.
I take weekends off.
Weekends off.
I very rarely, unless there's a story I'm following because I'm worried about injury or death or something else, like, you know, or something like that, like a mine disaster where we're trying to find out if people are going to survive or not. I worry about those folk. But if there's not something life or death, I turn it off, because you need a couple of days where you're not just being bombarded. And I think that's what I do, is I take weekends off and I treat it like almost like a job. It's my job to stay informed, but then I can have a couple of days where my informed is my family and my friends and my social circle, and not my intellectual circle.
Thank you.
Recently, I was talking to my doctor about just me not remembering. I'll put something on my calendar, like a lunch or something I'm supposed to have with someone or a meeting. And in my mind, I'm like, oh, I'll remember this. But then when that meeting comes up, I'm like, wait a minute, who am I supposed to be meeting with? I can't remember. And I was like, am I having some sort of issue? And she was like, Amy, most people, you know, kind of have like 3 different things that they're kind of keeping track of. You know, you are keeping track of so many things, and it's unfair to yourself to think that you can manage all that stuff without writing things down and making sure that you're doing some sort of brain dump at the end of the night. So that's one of the practices that I've had at night, is that I have, you know, just kind of jotted down some of the things that I had learned that day, some of the things that I might want to follow up on, but just kind of get it out of my head so that I can kind of relax that night and not have to think about all of the things that are going through my mind.
Well, I just want to say thank you all so much. This has been, first, a really quick hour, but very informative to me. And so thank you again. And thanks to the attendees tonight for spending time with us. We know that most of you are probably taking time out of your evening and precious moments that are normally spent doing other things. So thank you. It's been really helpful to hear your perspectives and throughout the series, really, to see how these topics are really connecting together. I am so excited about next week's session, our last session in the series. If you haven't signed up, please do so already. And as a reminder, you can catch a recording of tonight's session on the rvaengage.org website. Alexandra has included in the chat a link to the survey, so certainly you can fill that out and you'll get a link to that in your email as well. Definitely look forward to seeing you next week, and we're going to be ending the series with a discussion on how to approach those difficult conversations that I know we all find ourselves in. So thank you all and have a great night.